Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm David Clement, filling in for Tanya Granick-Allen. Earlier this month, telecom provider Rogers experienced a national outage, leaving many Canadians completely disconnected. Everything from home internet, cell phone coverage, and even the ability to dial 911 were impacted. In the wake of an outage that brought the country to its knees, many are asking how this happened and how it can be avoided in the future. Joining me to unpack the Rogers outage is Rosa Addario, Communications Manager at OpenMedia. Thank you, Rosa, for joining us on Counterpoint.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, right off the bat, what happened? How do we know what caused this?
So up until this point, I believe Rogers has released a statement citing, tech problems, infrastructure problems leading to this outage, which, if anyone could tell me what infrastructure outages mean to them, I don't really know what that refers to. But we do know that a major problem with their network caused nearly a third of the country to be without connectivity.
And so you mentioned a third of the country. It wasn't just home internet and cell phone coverage, if I'm understanding this correctly. It spread much further than that. Can you explain to viewers just how widespread the consequences of the outage were?
For sure. And it's a really great opportunity, this outage, for us to highlight exactly how much of a monopoly we're operating under in Canada. So Rogers, yes, of course, owns networks. They own, internet and cell phone networks. They also own part of the Interac infrastructure. So that is how we saw a lot of banking outages. They own grocery stores. They own stadiums. They really have their hands in a lot of different aspects of our industry. So not only were Rogers customers affected, but people who aren't even Rogers carriers were seeing issues because they were not able to use debit machines, were not able to use ATMs, were not able to send money. And it really speaks to how broken our system is when one company's tech problems really lead to affecting nearly the entire country.
Yeah, you raise a very good point there. Interact alone, I know, handles tens of millions of transactions a day. I don't think we have the data yet on what the total economic cost or impact was of the outage. But one thing that leaves a lot of people scratching their heads at is Rogers' response. What has their response been for consumers who are impacted by this, and is it adequate?
So I believe that Rogers has agreed to credit customers up to 5 days for the outage, 5 days on their next bill, which, is a significant amount given that it was only out for a day. But that being said, the impact was not just one day of not being able to, text or call. It was people not being able to access medical services. It was businesses losing thousands of dollars of sales because they couldn't accept debit transactions. It was people in remote communities being completely cut off from the rest of the world. So it's great to see Rogers making an effort to, make up the outage with their customers, but it isn't simply a financial reimbursement at this point.
And just on that Interac note, because that's the one that really makes me scratch my head, is how does the nation's payment provider, in many instances, solely rely on one network? I would assume, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that obviously puts them at a lot of risk. And obviously this outage highlights that.
Yes, definitely. And it really speaks to, again, our system. We live in an oligopoly. So we have these big three companies, Bell, TELUS, and Rogers, who control nearly 90% of our networks. And this is what happens when one of those companies goes down. So in this case, it was Rogers. If it happens again in the future, who knows what the impact would be under Bell, under TELUS. Each of those companies also own massive amounts of our economy. So it really is, this is, an example of a larger problem that we have, where we are seeing these massive telecommunications companies control so much of our infrastructure with really no other option for Canadians.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Oligopoly, I think, is an accurate word to describe the marketplace as it is today. We'll get more into what that word means for anyone who isn't familiar with it when we return from the break. And we're back on Counterpoint. I am joined by Rosa Addario, Communications Manager at OpenMedia. Before the break, Rosa, you were talking about the word oligopoly. Certainly, most people are familiar with monopoly, not the game, but the concept where one company or entity controls a market. What is an oligopoly, and what is the reality of the telecom space in Canada?
Right. It's a great question. So an oligopoly is, a system in which a few companies, so not only one, but a few companies control almost all of the goods and services within a market. So in this case, Bell, TELUS, and Rogers control almost our entire telecommunications infrastructure. And our system has created the illusion of choice. So we have what we call flanker brands like, Fido or Kudo, and those are companies that are subsidies of Rogers, Bell, or TELUS that operate to create the illusion of choice. So we have, people say, well, I have lots of providers to choose from. There's many, but the reality is that they're all controlled by one of these big three companies.
And so, in a normal marketplace, I think for most other goods, when something like this would happen, consumers would have the option of protesting with their wallet and taking their business elsewhere. As you noted, there is not a lot of competition in the space. What are some of the factors as to why our market is so consolidated? Is it government protection? What is it? What is the root cause here in terms of why the competition in the space is so limited?
It's important to highlight that it's not one single government decision that has led us to this point, but rather a series of decisions from a series of government agencies that have led to a market that is less competitive, less innovative, and more expensive. So we're really at a point where we are the result of years of decisions that have led us to, having little to no competition or option.
I'm dating myself a little bit. If I go back to the Harper years, I remember there was a lot of um, criticism and media attention about the prospect of U.S. carriers attempting to come to Canada. What is stopping a U.S. carrier or any international carrier from entering the space?
It's a great question. It's a question, we've been answering a lot lately. So the reason why providers in other countries, specifically when it comes to cell phone providers, so your cell phone plans, the reason why other companies or other countries have much lower cost options than we do, Canada pays some of the highest prices in the world for internet and cell phone, is because they have something called mobile virtual network operators. And that means that, let's say, a company like AT&T or Verizon would rent out effectively their infrastructure for a smaller company at a cost. And then that smaller organization would use the infrastructure to provide a service. So we don't have that in Canada. So if a smaller entity wants to come into our market, they have to build their own physical infrastructure in order to do so, which is hugely expensive. And there's a lot of barriers to doing so. So this is how Rogers, Bell, and TELUS are able to maintain control over our market because they own all of the physical infrastructure needed to do so.
And so it's an infrastructure question. If a company were to want to come to Canada and build their own infrastructure, is it just a cost barrier, or is there also a regulatory barrier that prevents them from doing so? Like, are U.S. providers ready and willing to come to Canada and build their infrastructure accordingly, or is that cost of operating in Canada make it economically unviable?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think for a lot of smaller providers, we've seen lots of interest from independent service providers in the United States and in other parts of the world who are keen to come to Canada and they want to provide low cost services. It is not necessarily viable for them to build that infrastructure. It is hugely expensive, and Canada is a very, very big country geographically. So it requires a lot of physical material to do so.
Right.
And our current government regulations don't allow for those smaller companies to provide the services by using another network's infrastructure like Rogers.
Got it. Okay, so it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's a little more
Exactly.
nuanced than maybe what we see on Twitter. I want to get into what some of the implications of lack of competition are. You've mentioned price. I want to talk to you about service when we return from the break. And we're back on Counterpoint. I'm joined by Rosa Addario. Rosa, you mentioned that Canadians pay more for internet, cell phones, and things like that, the services that telecom providers provide us. Give viewers a description or an explanation of just how much more we pay in comparison to, let's say, the United States or Europe.
Right. So in other parts of the world, there are plans that you can access that are, let's say, $20 a month for your cell phone that would provide you 10 gigabytes of data, off the top of my head. A similar plan in Canada would cost 10 times the amount that it would in other parts of the world. And it varies country to country. But part of the reason why we pay such high prices is because there is no competition in our market. So because these big three control almost our entire market, they have no incentive to compete for our business because they know that we have nowhere to go. So in the instance of the Rogers outage, Rogers knows that, okay, yes, maybe we will lose our customer base to Bell or Telus, but we know that our prices are more or less in line with Bell and Telus because they have no motivation to charge us lower rates. There's nothing causing them to do so. They have no reason to lower their prices. So they can charge whatever they want because they know that they have the market, in a stronghold.
And I mean, price is obviously one way in which they attract customers. Service is another. I know that most people who've ever dealt with getting internet installed in their house get the 8-hour service window a week from when they first called. The person knocks while they're in the shower and they leave and tell you that they have to come back next week. Are we seeing a lack of competition in service quality as well beyond price?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I mean, price is usually the number one thing that we think of when we think about, switching. Maybe it's people don't want to pay these super, super high prices. And it's also a matter of, competition in terms of service. In a lot of parts of Canada, we're a very, very big country. It's not only that, oh, I don't want to pay the prices of Rogers, I don't want to pay the prices of Bell. It's Rogers is the only provider in my area, and my entire community is on the Rogers network. So when Rogers goes down, it's not, I wish I wasn't with Rogers today, I wish I had a Bell plan. It's, I wish there was any other provider in my area.
And what role do you think disruption could play in this space? I mean, I think of Starlink, which is still in preliminary phases. For anyone who doesn't know, that's Elon Musk's company, which provides some of these services via satellite. Do you think that there's potential there for disruption to not only provide some competition in urban areas, but more importantly for rural Canadians, especially those Indigenous folks who have one provider or in some instances no provider? Is Starlink or some other concept like that a viable option in the future?
It's exciting to think about these new innovative options, these new providers who are looking to disrupt our market. We have seen over the past decade a loss of competition. So, for instance, we know right now Rogers is trying to buy Shaw, which is a Western provider and a huge innovator in the telecom market. If Rogers is allowed to do so, their next outage will affect that many more people. They will have that much more control over our networks. We see, there is a history of these large companies buying up smaller independent providers in Canada. So it would be great to see an innovator come into the market who is providing a different service, who is disrupting the way that our competition system works and really speaking to the lacks in our oligopoly.
Now, this may be a little too far forward in the future, but are there regulatory hurdles that prevent that type of disruption in terms of Starlink? Because my understanding is that they don't necessarily rely on the traditional infrastructure you've already alluded to.
Right. So it's not only the infrastructure problem that we've spoken about a little bit, that of course poses a problem. It is also our need for comprehensive competition law reform. So our competition laws are weak and are outdated, and they don't allow for proper competition, innovation, and disruption in our markets. So what we are advocating for is really to push our government towards law reform, which is a commitment that they've previously made, to create a market that allows for more competition, that drives down prices, that gives consumers options, and that reaches people across the country.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably piquing the ears of a lot of people when they hear better prices and more competition. I want to dive into law reform in our next segment, which will be what we discuss when we return. And we're back on Counterpoint. I'm joined by Rosa Addario. Before the break, you mentioned competition law reform. You'll have to provide me a bit of a history lesson in terms of what that actually means.
Yeah, so it's a great question. And I mean, I'm a little lost for words at where to start. A competitive and a strong economy is one that drives prices down, gives smaller enterprises a chance in our market, and promotes innovation. And so over the past 10 years, not only in the telecom sector, but specifically to speak to our oligopoly when it comes to internet and cell phone providers, we have seen these large companies, so Rogers, Bell, and Telus, eat up and consume smaller providers and create greater concentration in our market. So providers like MTS in Manitoba, like Shaw in the West, we recently saw last week that ExploreNet is planning to sell. All of these small companies provided different options to the big three, albeit they were small, independent, maybe only available in parts of Canada. When we lose those small players, we really, consolidate further the control that these companies have over us. We get further away from lower prices, and we get further away from allowing for small competitors to compete in the market.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about telecom, it sounds a lot like the same conversations we have about airlines or grocery stores or banks.
Yeah.
It feels like this is very built into the Canadian economy, unfortunately. Some on the more, let's say, progressive side of politics have issued calls for some sort of national provider or something along those lines. I'm a little skeptical when I hear that because my mind goes to the entity running passport offices, creating infrastructure for a telecom network. But is there viability there? Is that a real solution? Or is leaning on the private market and making it as competitive as possible the direction we should be pursuing?
It's a really interesting conversation that has come out of this whole outage. And, we as an organization are in favor of anything that gives more people in Canada access to more affordable and reliable internet. We already have some version of a national provider in Saskatchewan with SaskTel, which is a Crown corporation. And so there's definitely a viability there if it's something that we see our government show concentrated interest in investing in the future. That being said, we're a long way away from that type of system being built, being regulated, and being operational. So in the short term, what our government can do is that competition law reform that we've talked about, blocking the Rogers Shaw buyout. Those are two things that really will speak to opening up our market and allowing for more competitive choice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a I know a pending question in this space is whether or not that kind of consolidation serves consumers in any way. I think that proponents of it would say that these are two businesses and they should be free to sell if Shaw shareholders approve the sale, then they should be free to do so. What's your response to that?
I mean, the ultimate goal in our case is to see how this will serve Canadians and will serve people in Canada. To us, this will not serve Canadians. It will drive up prices. It will lead to fewer jobs in Alberta. It will lead to more concentration in the market. It will lead to outages like this in the future, having even more of an impact. So it really is the job of our Competition Bureau and of our Competition Tribunal to assess these situations and evaluate whether people in Canada's best interests are really at the heart of this, of this deal, or really if it is a marriage between two large corporate entities that are looking to make more money off of a system that serves them and disadvantages their consumers.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, is there a consumer welfare standard being met in any of these mergers or consolidations, not just in telecom, but across the economy? Rosa, it has been a pleasure to have you on Counterpoint. I appreciate you joining us and giving us your insight on not only the Rogers outage, but how we create more competitive markets that benefit consumers.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, the Rogers outage has certainly highlighted the need for more competition. How we get there is still uncertain, but I know that all Canadian consumers would certainly benefit from it.